Hello everyone, welcome to Code and Learn. So in the last video, we implemented the model, that is the model for our incoming request. In this video, we are going to work on the handler or programming the business logic for this handler. So last time when we worked on handler, we just added skeletons for it. Now it's time to add the business logic. The first thing I'm going to do is define an interface here for our DB operations. So as you know, interface is just an abstract type or just describes the behavior of the part of code that we are creating the interface for. In our case, we are creating an interface for the DB operations. So let's do that. So I'm calling it news storer. In our interface, the first method that we need to have is to create a news object or a news record in the database. So for that, I will add the method create. It will be a method that accepts a news post request body, returning a news post request body that is for the created news or a error. Later on, when we work on the actual store or the database, we will update it to DB models. For now, this should work for us. After create, let us create a method for finding a news by its ID. I can just call it find by ID. We will provide the ID of the news, which will be a UUID or a unique ID. So we can import UUID type from the Google UUID package and say find this news and in return news post request body an error. Since Google UUID is not imported, we need to do that. What you can simply do is just run go mod tidy and that should pick up the missing package and add it to our go mod file. Let me create all the other methods and then we can talk about them. So as you can see here, after find by ID, we added a method to find all the news in our database. Then delete by ID, that is to delete a news by its ID. And last, update by ID, that is to update a news record in our database. So based on this interface, we can program our handlers. Let's remove this. First thing we will do is get the logger from the request context that we injected earlier. So we can say logger is equal to logger from context, get the request context. Let's just log a info data saying request received. Next, we need to parse the request body. For that, we will use JSON decoder. First, let us create a variable called news request body of type news post request body. Then let us parse it from the incoming request body. For that, we will do JSON.newDecoder, create a decoder from request body and then decode it into the news request body, pass a pointer to it. If error not is equal to nil, there was a problem parsing the request body. In that case, we will log the error, say logger error failed to decode the request and then error, which is error. So in this case, if we fail to parse the request body from the incoming request, it is because there was a problem in the request body. So in that case, we will write back 400 bad requests to the response. For that, we'll use the response writer, write header, say http:// bad request, and then return from here. Next, we need to validate the request body. For that, let's call the validation method on news post request body. So we can say error is equal to news post request body dot validate if, and then if error not is equal to nil, we log it. Logger dot error failed to validate or request validation failed, and then pass in the error. This time, along with writing the header for bad request, we need to return the error as well. That is the error from validation. So we can do write header http:// bad request and then write the errors, which will be byte data. For that, we can just do error dot error and then return. So here, as you can see, writer is returning int of number of bytes written and then error. We are ignoring the error, but if you want, you can handle the error and return a 500 internal error. Now, if validation passes, we need to create the news in our database. So we can call the database method, but for that, we need to use the interface. So post news is a function that returns a handler func. As an argument to this function, we can use news store. So now we have access to news store. So I can do if error ns.create post request body, which is what we get from the JSON decoder. Error not is equal to nil, log the error, and then write a internal server error back to the response. For that, we will again use the write header status internal error and then return. Otherwise, to mark that the news was created, we will use the status created. Please note that if we were not supplying the status here, the handler func will automatically write a 200 status, that is status OK, back to the response. So that's it for the post news. You can see handler test is complaining about not receiving a news store. So let us update it. Since we are defining an interface for news store, we can create a mock implementation of it. This is basically how you do testing when your code is dependent on some other package or some other piece of code. So in our handler underscore test, let us create that. Type mock news store, which is a struct, since it needs to have a method on it. Here I'm going to create a boolean saying error state or EERR state, which will mark if the return should be an error. Now let us define on the methods on it. Let me close the sidebar, move handler to here. So first we need to have the create method, mock news store, create, return a news post request body or handler.news post request body and an error. Inside the method or the mock method, we will see if m.error state is true, we need to return an error. In that case, we will just return an empty body. So I can initialize here to news and here to error. If error state, we can just say news, which should be initialized variable to its nil value. And for error, we will use errors.new and supply a error saying some error. And if not, then we just return news and nil. Similarly, let me add the other methods to the mock store. Similar to what we did earlier, for find by ID, we can do m.errorstate. If that is true, we return an error saying return news error.new some error. And in the end, return news and nil. Next, we should add find all. Return an array of handler dot and an error if there's one. Similar to what we did earlier, to news and then error, and just copy paste what we have here. Now let me create the other two, that is delete by ID and update by ID. So here we have added the other two. Similar to what we did in the earlier three methods, we do the same. If error state, return error, otherwise nil. So now, since we have implemented all the methods defined on news store, we should be able to satisfy the interface that is expected by post news. I'm going to close that. And now let us go to our post news test. In here, let us just pass mock news store. So here it's complaining that we haven't satisfied the interface. We just need to update it because our method is not accepting a request body. So for create, we can accept one. This should make it satisfy the interface. And as you can see, the error is now gone. Now, since we have implemented the post news handler, let us add some tests for it. Let me write down all the tests that I want to add. First is invalid request body or invalid request body JSON. This is the case where the JSON body provided by the request is not valid. Next, I want to add a test where the request body is not valid or where one of the validations failed that we created in models. So any of these validations. That's our second case. I just noticed that our router is complaining because it expects a new store. So we can update here to say ns handler.newStorer and just pass it on to here. This time we will see an error in CMD. That is, we expect something here. For now, we can just say nil. Now let's go back to our handler test. Invalid request body is our next error. Then we want to have when the database operation fails or DB error. And if everything works, we need to have a success test case. So I'm just going to update this and say expected status created. Now the mock store implementation should come from the test cases because we want to test the response if there's an error and other cases where there's no error. So here I can just say store, which is of type handler.newStorer. This way, when I call the post news, I can just provide the store. So that's it for our setup. I missed one thing, that is providing the request body. Here, as you can see, when we are creating a request, we are providing a nil body, but this should come from the test cases. So I will just say tc.body, and here body is of type io.reader, which is accepted by the request or when we create the request. Now for invalid JSON body, we need to provide a invalid JSON blob. So I can say strings.newReader, that creates a IO_reader. Inside it, this creates an IO_reader from the provided string. Inside it, I will just say I will just add a invalid JSON. For store, we will just say newsmock store with no error state. And in this case, we expect the status to be http:/status bad request. Next, let me fill in the case for when the request validation fails. So similar to what we did earlier, we are adding a body which is missing tags. So we should error out. As such, the request status should be bad request. Then we have the DB error. In this case, the request needs to be a valid request, but the error state on the DB should be set to true so that we get an error response. So let me put that in here. So as you can see, I have added a case for DB error. In this case, we have added the tags to make sure our request passes, but we have set the error state on the mock DB that we added to false. Last one is the success case. Let me fill it up. That's our success case. Error state is set to false, which is the 0 value for a bool, and then we have a valid request. Let us save it. Just to recap, inside the test, we are creating a request for provided parameters, calling the person used to return a handler func, and then asserting on the response. Now let me test it by running the test on it. And as you can see, all tests are passing. So for practice, I will suggest you to follow this handler coding and the test and implement all the other handlers. This way you will learn how to do it yourself. That's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, post a comment under the video or reach out to our Discord server. Until next time, happy coding.